Hello, I'm Richard Pears, and I'm going to talk to you tonight about the history of our smallest room, the toilet. People often ask me, why am I talking about the toilet? How did I come to learn about this subject? And well, my great interest is architecture, and particularly country houses. And I was once asked to give a talk at a conference about country house technology. But of course, somebody from Craigside was already talking about electricity and hydraulic power. Somebody else was talking about gas. So I said, well, is anybody talking to you about toilets? And there was a silence on the end of the phone. And I said, okay, I'll talk to you about country house toilets. So this is then expanded from that to history of the toilet. Now, the toilet is interesting because we often think that once human beings have mastered a particular form of technology, that's available to all of us, and we just build upon that invention. Sanitation through history reminds us that that isn't the case. It's quite sophisticated means of dealing with sanitation. Human sanitation existed hundreds, thousands of years ago, and then were lost for over a millennia in Europe until they were reinvented. So, technology can come and go. It depends on whether we have, as a society, the means and the will to continue and maintain it. So why is this important? Why is sanitation important? Well, here we have three characters: King John, King Henry V, and David Livingstone, two the highest people in the land, kings of England. David Livingstone, well-known Victorian explorer. The thing these three men have in common is that they all died of dysentery. A reminder that no matter how high you are in the land or how recent to us, recent times, the lack of hygiene, lack of sanitation can be fatal. But of course, this knowledge of sanitation and the requirement for sanitation isn't new. In Orkney, the far north of Scotland, a remarkable village was discovered in the 19th century when sand dunes blew away. And it was discovered that here was a village that had been inhabited from about 3,500 years BC. And it was a village, each a group of houses formed within what's called a mound of refuse and waste. People dug down into that, lined the rooms with stone. They created passageways lined with stone through the mound, and within that they also built drains. Now this, you think, how do we know this is the case? Well, these have been excavated. This is very sophisticated and quite incredible when you think that this was 4,000 or 5,000 years ago in the British Isles. And other similar villages have been found in Orkney and elsewhere in the British Isles as well. So people were planning this. Somebody had to plan where these houses would be within this mound of refuse. And they built it within the mound of refuse because of the need for insulation. If you've ever been to Orkney, it's very windy and very cold. And so the earth and the refuse would provide some insulation for the houses. And of course, there's also very little natural wood, trees within Orkney. They rely very much upon driftwood being washed up, crossing the Atlantic or coming across the Pentland Firth from northern Scotland. And that wood had to be prioritised as fuel, although they probably use peat for household fuel, but particularly to create roof structures across the tops of these houses. But what is interesting is that each of these houses had a room within the thickness of the wall, cells here. And these are almost certainly toilets because they're connected to drains. By the way, you also have an industrial building on the edge of the group of houses, almost like an early industrial estate on the edge. This building here was used for the manufacture of stone tools. So if we look within these houses, they're all built on a common plan. You have to again imagine a pitched roof of tree trunks and then heather and thatch forming the waterproof covering above it. And in the center of each house is a fireplace lined with stone slabs. Each house has a very ornate dresser, again made of stone slabs. The stone on Orkney is very friable. It will break up into long, thin slabs. And you can see that in the construction of the walls, but also particularly in the construction of this beautiful stone dresser. Remember, this is 4,000 years old or more. And on this were found stone artifact tools and perhaps spiritual artifacts that represented something to the people who lived here. And on the opposite side of the fire from the dresser was the door. So I'm standing here on top of the wall, looking down into the house, and below me is the doorway from the passageway within the mound of refuse. And then around the outside, you have other stone slabs used to create beds. And you have to imagine these filled with heather and bracken and animal skins close to the fire to give people some warmth. And clear-lined pots in the floor, they would be to store shellfish from the beach, which is nearby, and to keep those alive until they were going to be cooked. But what's really interesting is this doorway in the corner here. And here's a picture of it here. And within this room, there was a drain beneath the floor. And it's almost certainly that this, given the fact it's separated from the rest of the house, this is almost certainly being used as a toilet. So in Orkney, 3,000 years BC, 5,000 years ago, they had ensuite rooms with toilets. And just think, if we go to Beamish today, you will see, outside toilets. Many people will remember outside toilets in their own houses or their parents' or grandparents' houses. So, as I say, sanitation comes and goes depending on the willingness to look after it, to maintain it. Of course, the Romans, as the great civilizers, were well aware of the need for sanitation. Were aware, if you've been to Rome, of the great baths that were constructed for people to bathe and keep themselves clean. And here in the northeast, we have some very fine examples of Roman sanitation on the Roman forts along Hadrian's Wall. And here we have a plan of the corner of Housestead's fort, where we have this Roman system of sanitation. And the Romans realized that large numbers of people, particularly soldiers living together, needed to have a bathhouse where they could wash themselves, and they needed to have an area for waste, for going to the toilet. And as well as having a place to go to the toilet, you also needed a water supply to clean yourself afterwards. So here we have at Housesteads, just after the 2nd century AD, the means of providing toilets for a large body of soldiers living together. And what you have is a latrine block against the wall of the fort, and notice the drain going outside the fort, and a drain then carried the waste away. But what the Romans had done was create a channel under the floor, and I'll show you a picture of it in just a moment. And there was a cistern over here that brought the water in. That then flushed out the waste from underneath the seats and out of the drain. But they also needed for the soldiers to be able to clean themselves afterwards. So here you have a cistern that brings water in to a bucket B on the plan here, which is where the soldiers could use to clean themselves. So this is the basic principle. You have two supplies of water, one to get rid of the waste and the other to clean yourself. Here it is, operating along Hadrian's Wall on the very edge of the Roman Empire from 200 AD. But this technology was, after the collapse of Roman rule in the 5th century, this technology was lost for well over 1,000 years in Europe. Here's a picture of how it worked. So here is the latrine block on the edge of the fort, and there's an illustration there which I've just shown you here. And this is the soldiers. As you can tell, the Romans are very sociable people. So you sit on toilet, and you've got the drain running underneath the seats, as I showed you, leading out beneath this one, out through the fort wall. And there you've got the other water supply coming in to provide somewhere to wash your hands, and also a water coming down through here, so the soldiers can use a sponge on the end of a stick to clean themselves with, using a water supply there. So that is the ideal of sanitation that was lost for over 1,000 years. Vindolanda, recently they discovered a Roman wooden toilet seat. So we know that that illustration by Ronald Embleton that I showed you just a moment ago was accurate. The medieval period, we have these fantastic castles and abbey churches, and we see attempts to provide, certainly for the very richest members of society, the kings and the aristocracy, a means of sanitation as well. And here in Newcastle, the great keep that survives shows this planning to perfection, because all of the toilets and the latrines within the castle discharge into this turret on the side, on the west side of the keep, and all the waste ends up in this chamber on the ground floor. There's a picture of it there. And what happens then, you say, well, this is where the gong firmer comes along, because the gong firmer is somebody who comes along and it's their job to clean out chambers like this and take away the waste. In some instances, there's evidence of cisterns on the roof of keeps being used that water could be poured down the shafts to try and clean them out occasionally as well. But again, very sophisticated planning to arrange all of the toilets. You can see these windows here that provided ventilation to the latrines on this side of the castle. Sometimes we have the remains of the latrines built in. So this is a very fine example on the left-hand side here of Bransmouth Castle near Durham, where we have the stone seat, and then there's just a shaft that drops outside the castle there. Above it, you've got a little window to give some ventilation and some light. And then you've got a wall cupboard where you could put a lamp if it was dark, or you can use whatever you're going to use to clean yourself with, store it there as well. And this all built in stone, plastered. You can see the remains of stone, the plasterwork on the stone there, as an ensuite within a room, a chamber here. And sometimes we see other forms of guardrobes. This is Lindisfarne Castle, Dunstanburgh Castle, the Lilburn Tower at Dunstanburgh Castle. And here we've got two guardrobes that are corbelled out. So you would have a seat inside here, and of course this is outside the castle. So the waste just drops outside the castle from these guardraobes. But you have several rooms stacked on top of one another, each of which has its own toilet. So this was very luxurious living for the 14th century in England. At Langley Castle, along towards Haltwhistle in Northumberland, we have a very fine example of medieval sanitation. The castle was built in the 1300s, and it appears that one of the towers was constructed. This one is this one over here. This tower appears to have been intended to house the toilets within the castle. So just as we saw at Newcastle, here we have at Langley Castle, again, an attempt to concentrate all of the toilets in one corner, which makes it easier to clean and obviously keep the smell away from the rest of the building. And on each of the floors of the castle, there were 4 guardraobes. So on the ground floor, you ended up with 12 guardraobes discharging through these chutes at the bottom. And then actually on the ground floor, this little structure down here with the 2 windows, there's another 2 guardraobes on each side of the tower there. You can just see the chambers for them there. And on each floor, you can see 4 arches. So again, each of these would have had a seat, and then the shaft has been blocked up by later paving. But this would be 4 people could sit along there to use the toilet, and then 12 people in total could be using the toilets within this section of the castle. So again, very sophisticated planning to try and achieve this, and even more so because a small stream ran along the edge of this corner so that it could help to wash away the waste. Just as the Roman soldiers appreciated the need for sanitation, so too did medieval monks. Lots of people living together in close proximity, and the risk of disease and infection was quite high. So they knew they needed to to be able to just get rid of their waste and also clean themselves. So we see here Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, a beautiful structure, but we have very finely preserved drains. So again, just like the Romans, you would have toilet seats above here, the waste drop down into the drain, and there's a drain channel with water from the stream could flush it away. And here we've got the River Skell runs along here, and the Lay Brothers Infirmary and the latrines for the Lay Brothers Dormitory are all situated to one side. So the water from the river would come through this channel and wash it away. And again, the abbot's house had its latrine close to the river as well to be used, and the infirmary had latrines that could be cleaned by the river as well. So medieval monks were well aware of the need for sanitation, and quite often before they went into the dormitory, you would have what's called a laver, a pipe of water where they could wash their hands and before they went in to eat. Now, again, that technology, the monasteries were dissolved, castles fell into disuse, and we have a period of several hundred years where there is no indoor sanitation for the majority of people. And what I find interesting here is that there are very beautiful country houses constructed. We know many of these around the northeast, Wallington and this one here, Backworth Hall, constructed. Beautiful plasterwork, beautiful paintings, sculpture, furniture, all bought, huge sums of money, lots of money spent on the house. So Backworth, for example, was designed by the architect William Newton, who also designed the Newcastle Assembly Rooms. And it cost Robert Gray, the sum of money, £2,597, 9 shillings and 2 pence to construct. And here is the plan that William Newton drew for him. And on the back of the plan, William Newton wrote, "There are no closets to the rooms, so there ought to be conveniences made some other way." Essentially, this is the plan, this is the house you want me to design. Just to remind you, there's no toilets. So what are you going to do? Interestingly, another note from Gray back to Newton asked him, was it best to have square or round section chimneys for the boys to climb up? So again, a reminder that a lot of this dirty work was done by people, boys and small children expected to clean chimneys with awful consequences. And the whole issue of how to deal with the conveniences required in a country house like this are again down to servants. Sometimes you would have separate toilets in the grounds. So at Seaton Delaval, there's this very fine structure in the grounds designed by Sir John Vanbrugh. It's called a little house, a euphemism that tells us that it's a toilet. But this was very finely plastered inside. Others existed at Wallington Hall, Gibbside, Blagden, and they often had quite ornate interiors. People were going to spend some time here, so they would be plastered, they would be painted, and very fine structures, almost like eye catchers within the landscape. Of course, other aspects would be if you're wealthy enough, you would have servants who could take away the waste for you. So if you didn't have toilets within your house, you might have a commode such as this. Now, the one on the left-hand side was designed for King Charles II, and it's made of red velvet and gold pins. But it's essentially a wooden box with a pewter bowl inside, and the king sits on this velvet cushion, and when he's finished, the servant takes away the pewter bowl and gets rid of the waste. And when it's not in use, the box lid folds down and just looks like a very nice box with red velvet and gold pins in the corner of the room. There's another similar example that I saw in a chateau in France, which again is simply a very finely constructed chair, very nice piece of furniture, and there is a wooden lid that goes over the porcelain bowl there, but it's essentially the same thing. What you need are the servants to take away the waste afterwards. And I think this is why we have this situation where these grand country houses, at a time when people were building huge canals across Britain, water fountains in the gardens, and yet no provision for toilets within the houses. Partly, I think, because of the fear of damaging some of the very fine plasterwork and decorations inside if there were water leaks, because the plumbing simply wasn't up to the task. But also, I suspect, because it was just cheaper to employ servants. Servants could multitask. They could be getting rid of emptying the toilets at some point, but later on they could serve at dinner, they could do other tasks, they could work in the ground, the gardens, and other things as well. And so what you often find are, within bedrooms, references to chamber pots. And of course, what you didn't want is to meet your servant coming down from the bedroom carrying your last night's waste. So what you often have in country houses are back stairs, and these are two plans: Dissington Hall in Northumberland and Whitfield Hall, very similar to Backworth Hall. A very grand main staircase for the guests and the family to use to go upstairs, but next to that is a separate enclosed staircase for the servants, which would often go from the cellars right up to the attics, so the servants could quickly be called upon should they be needed to any of the rooms in the house, but they could also bring up water for bathing, and they could also take away chamber pots and get rid of the waste from there. So if you look at the situation in the 1770s, that technology that existed, that knowledge of sanitation that the people at Skara Brae had 3000 BC, and that the Romans had been able to engineer, and medieval monasteries had been able to instill within their buildings, that had all disappeared from use. There seemed little innovation, little incentive to innovate, despite, as I've said, the massive works in water engineering that went into canals and fountains. Suspect the fear of damage to interiors, and just the fact that the servants and backstairs are a cheaper alternative. What was really needed were the advances in technology, and also the means of giving an efficient water supply that would drain out the waste, the plumbing that was going to be safe enough that it wouldn't leak, and also then, once it's out the house, sewers to take away the waste, and also then some kind of furniture within the houses that would enable this all to take place. There had been some attempts at doing this. So Sir John Harrington was a courtier in the reign of Elizabeth I in England, and he came up with the idea of a flushable toilet within your mansion. So what it relied upon was water coming in through this pipe into a cistern. Now I might just be able to make this out. He's showing that this is clean enough water because there are fish swimming in there, so this is clean water coming in. And then you have this structure here is the toilet. That's the toilet seat, which you can move aside. The cover, you sit on that. When you beat the toilet, you then can pull this lever, and that will then flush the water through, and it will drop the water into a drain beneath and take it outside. The problem, of course, with this is this simply did not have the plumbing required to do this, and nor the flow of water. So this might have worked if you had a moat that could provide you with a flow of water to provide for the cisterns, but lots of houses on high hills and others still relied upon water being hauled up from a well by the servants. So you haven't got this water being piped through. So his invention had little impact. What people did instead, as I've said, they used servants. They often had earth closets. So here's a drawing of Wallington Hall in Northumberland, 1777, and against the side of the house you have these earth closets that can be used, as well as little houses within the grounds. But again, it all relies upon the servants. And being in the countryside, there was a use for this in agriculture as well, which I'll come to shortly. The interior of Wallington, though, this plan from 1750 shows that as well as the earth closets outside, there was some knowledge of sanitation that could be available if you're rich enough to afford it. So for example, we have a little house built against one side of the house, which is accessible from two sides. You've got two toilets here. Notice the toilet seats there, and another one in here. And next to them, you've got the ash hole. So again, you could get the ash and throw it onto the waste, and it could then be carted away later on. But what is really interesting about this is over here, in what is now the library, and this has disappeared after 19th century refitting of the drawing room as a library. You have here a water closet and a cistern for water in this corner. And this was accessible from Sir Walter Blackett's bedchamber and dressing room and the anteroom. And there's a jib door, a hidden doorway in the corner of the wall. It's still there if we go to Wallington, but this area is now covered by bookcases. So Sir Walter could go from his bedchamber to use the water closet. And what he probably had was something like this, which is, again, a very finely crafted toilet seat. And behind it is a cistern of water that you can use to bring water in. It's not particularly sophisticated, because what you can do is that's your pull lever there. So when you're finished, you pull the lever and water comes into the bowl here, which is down the bowl down and empties down into this another bowl underneath that you can see here. It's not particularly sophisticated, because all you're doing is using water to empty the waste out of this bowl into another bowl down below. You still need the servants to take it away. This isn't connected to a sewer yet, but it's this understanding that water can be used to flush away the waste. What really was needed was the advances in plumbing technology that would enable this waste to be removed via sewers beneath the houses and then taken away from there, either soakaways or properly built sewers. What they needed particularly was the lead piping that was secure enough that it wasn't going to split or burst and damage your house or leak into the ground outside. And the man we have to thank for this is a man called Alexander Cummings. He invented the S-trap and the cistern. So the idea of the S-trap is that it uses water in the trap, in the bend of the S, to stop smells coming back into from the sewer below. And also a man called Joseph Bramah, who was a very capable locksmith and inventor. And he came up with the idea of a valve, a hinged valve that would drop the waste out. We use Cummings' invention of the S-trap, and you would have a cistern that dropped water. So here, above here, we've got a cistern that drops water down, pushes the waste out through the S-bend and then down into a sewer. This was the pinnacle of technology in the 18th century. And this was a very capable design. Over 7,000 had been installed by the end of the century, and it remained the basis of toilet technology for over 100 years. The idea of a cistern at higher level, dropping water down and pushing the waste through an S-bend into a sewer. And we have an example at Hebburn Hall in South Tyneside of the installation of two of these water closets, which cost £11, 8 shillings each. Now, bear in mind, a servant might be paid £20 a year. You get some idea of the cost of these, this technology here. But what we also have, this is from Capheaton Hall, another 18th century house, is an 18th century manual for a plumber to install a Bramah water closet at Capheaton Hall. And as I say, you've got a cistern at higher level. This drops the water down a pipe. There it goes into the bowl, pushes the water through the S-bend down into the sewer and takes it away. But of course, the cost of these was so great, these could only be afforded by the wealthy, because you not only needed the toilet inside the house, you needed the sewer system outside to take it far enough away from your house. That's all very well, again, as I say, for country houses where you've got land around that you can soak away the waste. In the towns, there was no such space or provision for sewers. What we have, some fine examples of this, a German woodcut from the 16th century, which shows the danger of walking through towns at the time, where someone walking along in his finery is walking along the street and somebody throws their waste bucket of toilet material out of the window into the street. And similarly, here we have another example by the brilliant William Hogarth, one of his illustrations called Night from 1738, showing this sort of terrible situation in London streets at the time. But you have here an elderly couple making their way along, and somebody decides to throw their chamber pot out of the window and land on them. And this is a reminder, if we read diaries of the time, if we read people like Samuel Pepys, you'll read about how young boys and girls and poor people would wait by the side of the pavement with brushes. And many wealthy people would wear wooden clogs over their shoes when they were going outside. Because, of course, you have not just human waste in the streets, but you have horse waste and other material here as well. So you wear clogs over your shoes while you're out in the street. These small boys and girls would be there. You could pay them to walk in front of you with a brush and brush the waste out of your way as you walked around the streets of the capital city of the British Empire. So again, there simply wasn't the sanitation there available. What people tended to have was, if they had a garden or a yard at the back of their house, would be a cesspit with a wooden house, a wooden structure above it where you could go to the toilet. And these are, I have a friend who's an archaeologist who says these are the greatest sources of social history you can find, because of course all kinds of things, not just the waste goes into it, and the waste can be analysed to get information about people's diets, illnesses, but the things that fall out of people's pockets while they're at the toilet, so coins and other memorabilia and trinkets, but also these they get used just as dumping grounds, so broken crockery and other things get thrown into these holes in the ground as well. And eventually you cover it over and you dig another hole and start again. The other innovation was to have people who would come and take away the waste. And here's a business card from a man called John Hunt, who was a nightman and rubbish carter. Now, what's really interesting about this is that he says on his business card, he is the successor to the late Mr. Brooke. So he considered this a business worth inheriting or worth succeeding to. And his card shows what he does. Here he's going, this is him and his colleague on a night time. Look, there's the moon out, going to the back door of a house in the town, one of these fine houses. The servant opens up, they go in, they empty the chamber pots and things into buckets, they put them on their cart, and then they take it out into the fields and they sell it. Because talking euphemistically about this as waste, but actually we have to remember this wasn't waste at all. This was being used in agriculture. So we have a whole business of rubbish carters, or nightmen as they were called, taking away waste from towns and cities and selling it on to farmers. Here's an example of a house in Charlotte Square, Newcastle, for Rafe Carr of Dunstan Hill House. And again, you see exactly how this worked. This is the town wall is behind here. This is just off Westgate Road in Newcastle. And you've got a toilet in the small courtyard at the back, and another one under an overhang accessible from the back of the house as well. So you can imagine the nightmen coming to this door, collecting the waste from the toilets and taking it away from there. Now, what they would have would be things like earth closets. So here's an example from a museum in Dorset. And although there were some advances in water technology, it's a very inefficient way of using water to get rid of waste. Many across the world, it's impossible to have water as a means of getting rid of the waste. It's far too precious. So you have earth closets or ash closets. And this example was invented by Reverend Henry Moule in Dorset. And he was worried about the danger of poisoned water, as he saw it, from toilets being flowing into rivers. He was of the opinion that using ash or earth would be a way of containing the waste and taking it away safely. And because wherever Britons went around the world, there was very little opportunity to have flushable toilets, the earth closet went with them. So we find these all over the former British Empire being used as easy means of getting rid of the waste. Again, it's the same idea. You sit on the toilet and there's a bucket underneath. There's the example there. His innovation was behind here is instead of a water cistern, there is a cistern filled with sand or with earth or ash. And when you're finished, you pull the lever there or there, and it pours some earth in to cover the waste, and you can then take it away and dispose of it. And then we get to things that we are very familiar with. So this is from Beamish, which I'm sure many of you will see. And we have the typical coal house and ash closet next to it in the backyard. And of course, thousands and thousands of these existed across the northeast and across Britain. And very typical, very distinctive. You can recognize this combination of two hatches in the back wall, one for the ashes to be thrown in and the other one for the night soil to come out as well. And there's just the plan of it there as well. And you can tell which one is the toilet because of the ventilation slots at the top. So again, something very, very familiar to us. But that was all very well when new villages, pit villages were being laid out. You could plan against sanitation. In many towns, there simply wasn't the means to do this. People were living in tenements, several families living within the same room or the same terrace house, and particularly in places like Newcastle and Gateshead. So here we have a plan of Gateshead, and Gateshead underwent huge expansion, nearly tripled in population between 1811 and 1851, from just under 9,000 to 25,000 people. And of course, Gateshead at the time was largely concentrated on what we now call Bottle Bank and Church Street, with some housing on the other side of the railway line up towards Swinburne Street and Oaklandgate. What's particularly interesting, of course, is this density of population and how susceptible people were to disease, particularly diseases of sanitation like cholera. And cholera visited Gateshead numerous times and took away many, many poor people's lives. And the map we have here shows the number of places where people died of cholera in 1831. Each black dot is a death from cholera. And what's particularly interesting is just how concentrated some of these are. So Victoria Street over here, nearly every house, somebody died of cholera. Again, this street here next door, many people died as well. But what is really worrying is over here on Pipewell Gate and the bank running up from Pipewell Gate. And Pipewell Gate in 1841 had a population of 2,000 people. A street 300 yards long, had 3 privies and no sewer. So a huge problem with sanitation. Now, the 4 and 20, the body that preceded Gateshead Corporation, had considered whether or not it should build sewers in Gateshead, but it took the view that as Gateshead was built on the side of a hill next to a river, the rainwater would simply wash the waste into the river. Of course, if you're down on Pipewell Gate, the rain is washing the waste from the upper town into you. So it's not just the waste people are producing these 3 privies for 2,000 people, but it's all of the filth that's coming down the hill as well. And of course, the river is hideously polluted at this time as well. So this is why cholera was so devastating. And the lesson of what happened in Gateshead and in Newcastle was learned by a man called John Snow, Dr. John Snow, who was very famous, as you may know, for his work in Soho in London in 1855, where He had trained as a doctor in Newcastle and had worked in Gateshead during the cholera epidemics there as well. And when he worked in London, he realised that several cholera cases, a hotspot of cholera, was occurring around a water pump in Broad Street in Soho. And when he took the handle off the pump, the cholera cases started to dissipate because people had to go elsewhere. So he made the link between the water supply the people were drinking and using to clean themselves and the incidence of cholera. And when he then had the pump excavated, they discovered that the water pump had been sunk into an abandoned cesspit. And so the people were drinking horribly infected water and using it for sanitation as well. So he realised this from his experience in Gateshead and in Newcastle, that the link between dirty water and cholera and other diseases. But still very little action was taken, and it wasn't really until the 1850s that Parliament really took notice and began to do something about it. And this was because in 1858 there occurred what was called the Great Stink. It was a very long, hot summer. The River Thames sank to particularly low level. Now, of course, the Thames was the great artery of the British Empire, but it was also the greatest sewer in the British Empire as well. And so all these exposed mudflats were just reeked of waste from everything that was being thrown in the river. And Parliament, its finely built Gothic building, newly built by the side of the Thames, was right alongside this stench. And eventually Parliament considered moving out of London altogether because of the smell, but that persuaded them that they needed to do something about the sanitation. So these very fine streets of houses and shops that existed, such as Fleet Street and Oxford Street, all had been built without any sanitation. All the streets had to be dug up and sewers constructed, and toilets and sewers constructed into the houses and shops on either side. And of course, the other great innovation was the construction of water pumping stations to bring water into the towns and cities across the British Isles, and also to drain away the waste as well. And Bazalgette, the great Victorian engineer, responsible for this in London. The problem, of course, that again was down to the technology. It was only the Victorian period that it was possible to get this right. There had been, again, attempts to provide water supplies within towns. So in Newcastle, we have examples of logs being bored horizontally and then tapered at one end to fit within each other to try and create a pipe. But the trouble was, being wood, buried underground, very quickly rotted, they split, and were too fragile to use. Some people tried using lead and cast iron, but that was very expensive. It rusted or it decayed. Could be stolen if it was lead. So again, problems. Attempts were made to provide water into people's houses. So in 1680, there was a water pumping engine from the River Tyne at Sandgate in Newcastle, owned by a man called Cuthbert Dykes. And William Yarnwald, in 1697, claimed to be able to provide 50,000 gallons per week to 161 properties. These were very wealthy people who had paid to have a tap with piped water within their houses, or probably within a yard at the back of their house. We see some efforts at private provision. So the Conduit House in Durham Cathedral, in the college behind the cathedral, again provided piped water from a cistern to the canons' houses of the cathedral. But what was really needed was a major effort, which began to happen from the 1840s after the cholera epidemics, but really took place after Parliament was persuaded to pass legislation to achieve this. In the northeast, we see large water supplies being constructed, things like Whittledean reservoirs up to the northwest of Newcastle to provide water to the towns, and series of pumping stations that would bring water into the towns and also use the water to flush away any waste products as well. So these are the great innovations that begin to get a purchase on the need for sanitation within the towns of Britain. And within the home, this is the period of great Victorian innovation. And we've seen the Bramah water closet this was enhanced. And so we have firms such as Armitage being founded in 1817, and Shanks and others being founded. And these would provide you with, you could afford it, with a toilet within your house, and the plumbing required to fit with the new sewers being constructed as well. They initially made these out of cast iron, and as you can see, you could have them enameled and painted to go with your tiled bathroom if you're wealthy enough to afford this. But then they began, because of the problems of ironwork rusting, they began using earthenware to produce these. And of course we have the great innovator, as he's thought to be, but really wasn't such an innovator, Thomas Crapper, whose name is often associated with the great sanitary engineering of the Victorian period. He wasn't really an innovator, he was a manufacturer. And what he did was to buy up the patents of the intellectual property, really, of other inventors. So he bought Bramah and Giblin's designs and then improved them and then marketed them very heavily. And he achieved a really great coup in 1870 when he won the contract to fit out the Queen Victoria's new house at Sandringham in Norfolk. And this gave him his royal warrant. And of course, every patriotic Briton then wanted their toilet and lavatory and bath and other things provided by Thomas Crapper, which is how his name becomes associated with toilets. But he did insist on high quality, and he did make improvements to the designs to try and avoid some of the leaks that had occurred. But it was really his genius was in terms of taking other people's inventions and making them available to a mass market. And again, perhaps the most important innovation that took place towards the end of the 19th century was by a man called Albert Giblin. And again, we know his name is very little known because the patent was bought by Crapper's firm very soon afterwards. But it was Giblin who came up with the idea of a siphon within the toilet that would use a vacuum and a rush of water to push water into the bowl, and the vacuum would then draw the contents of the bowl and the water out again and take it into the sewer. So this brought together technologies such as the siphon and the vacuum, the S-bend that we have seen invented a century earlier, and within a porcelain bowl, so it wasn't going to rust and was much more stable. And so this is essentially the toilet we have today. But it was improved by Crapper and his nephew, and they bought the patent, and they then got the credit largely for Giblin's invention. And then we have other names like Twyford, who was a pottery manufacturer, and he was responsible largely for the replacement of the cast iron toilet with ceramic one-piece toilets, which again can be cast, and they weren't going to need assembly, so there were weak points. And they could have it in any colour. So this is from Beamish, the dentist's house there. You can have your bathroom fitted out with your tiles, your shower, your toilet, all of a piece. Now, of course, I've talked very much about the technology, therefore, of sanitation, but the other aspect is, what do you use about cleaning? Toilet paper was known in China from the 6th century AD, and it was certainly perfumed toilet paper was being mass produced from the 14th century in China. Modern toilet paper was invented in the United States in the 19th century, but of course you will be familiar with the tales of people using newspaper. If you have a pink bathroom, you read the Financial Times, and other such stories such as that. Other things that have been used through the centuries have, things like hand washing. If you go to Islamic countries, quite often you have the water supply to wash your hands after you've cleaned yourself. Some people use pebbles, moss, rags, or one that I found particularly interesting, the neck of a goose that is well downed. I don't know how you have a regular supply of geese to keep up with this, but there you are. And again, I've talked about this, I've used the euphemism waste, but this really isn't waste. The waste brings on a whole host of industries. So for example, the liquid waste, urea, is essential in many industries, from tanning of leather to produce shoes, to produce waterproof coats and other things. Here's an instance of the caves in Nottingham beneath the castle, which were hollowed out to make housing, but also factories and industries. And here we have these pits of urea. It must have utterly stunk to high heaven here, but you could do your curing of your leather within these vats of urine, to then be able to scrape away the animal fat from them and get the leather that you needed. The great glories of the medieval period, whether it's the Lindisfarne Gospels, a page of which we have here, these beautiful illuminated manuscripts, or stained glass windows, these rely upon a lot of urea to produce them. The blue particularly is a chemical used for a chemical reaction to get that very vivid blue that we see in this stained glass window from Canterbury Cathedral here of Adam digging the soil. So we have the different dyes used in the Lindisfarne Gospels are using a mixture of plants from around Lindisfarne, but then mixed with urea to give the reaction that's necessary to give different colours. And of course, all on an animal skin that has been dipped in urea to clean off the fat and the hair, so you get this beautiful smooth surface for writing. Other products, tweed jackets. You can go and read up on the internet about how Harris tweed is produced. Essentially, the wool is steeped in vats of sheep urine on the coastline around Harris, and they put in different plants to get the different colours of tweed, and then it's spun into the very fine jackets we have today. Other things, gunpowder uses urea, and some very unpleasant ones to think about. Until well into the 20th century, urea from animals was used in toothpaste and in shampoo and in face creams. Don't worry, there's now a synthetic form of urea that is used for all of these, but certainly in the past, this waste product was being used for other things that were very definitely essential aspects of life. So what of the future? Well, we still live in a world where many, many people live in terrible poverty and have very little sanitation. And this is a terrible, terrible killer. So 1.5 million children die from diarrhea and associated illnesses every year. 2.5 billion people have no access to toilets. What can you do? Because again, many of these countries, there isn't the supply of water that would provide Western style toilets. There's often religious considerations to think about, as I said, about Islamic hand washing instead. And where there is water, it needs to be used for cleaning and for drinking. So you can't just use to flush down toilet, and they simply don't have the sewer systems either. But also, they want to recycle the waste. So Bill and Melinda Gates of Microsoft, their foundation came up with a few years ago the Reinvent the Toilet Challenge. And they thought quite rightly that if we can put human beings into space and everything that goes up into space comes back, the water supply gets recycled in space. If we can do that in space on the space station, why can't we do it for people here on Earth? So they challenged engineers to come up with toilets that could be used around the world that used a maximum of 1.5 litres of water that could be recycled. It costs less than 5 cents a day to run, and it wouldn't have any water or sewage connections. You'd have to pour the water in, and then the water would have to be reused. And they could do that by using things like solar power. So there's a solar panel on the roof here that provides some electricity for a light during the night, and also to help with the cleansing of the water afterwards, and collecting of the waste. Other aspects, many parts of the world, particularly women, are in danger of going out at night, and so have to go to toilet at dusk, and then they can't go to the toilet again until the morning when it's light again. So ideas such as this one at University of the West of England in Bristol would be to use chemical reactions from the urine to provide electricity for lighting, so people wouldn't feel as vulnerable going out at night. And of course, that compost, the waste can be used in compost. And this is how it has been used. The gong firmers, the night men, this is what they were doing. throughout human history is collecting that waste and composting it to be used as agricultural fertilizer. And that's still used in many parts of the world today. So you can often go to National Trust places or countryside commission places where they will have composting toilets. And the idea is that you will use the waste, it will be used again in future. And a great deal of research has gone into looking at how, even in Western style toilets that rely upon water to flush them, how they can be the waste can be recycled by diverting the liquid and the solid waste, because we are throwing away some of the most precious elements on Earth: potassium, nitrogen, phosphorus. These are all essential to agriculture and to human life. So we can't just keep throwing them away or flushing them away. So how do we recycle those? And the waste, as we've seen with the Bill and Melinda Gates idea, can be used in composting and can be used as a biofuel. So there's a reduction in pollution. There's also a reduction in some elements such as things like the human birth control pill. Estrogen is going into the water, and we're ending up with hermaphrodite fish, because of the impact on hormones in animals that live in the seas and the rivers. All this needs to be dealt with to cut down on the pollution. So we may end up with this technology even in our own toilets in years to come. So, as I hope you'll have seen, the toilet, the smallest room, has a long and very fascinating history. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Hello everyone, welcome to Heritage Hour. This is Gateshead Archive at Home, and you've been watching our weekly online talk whilst our libraries are closed. A big thank you tonight to our guest speaker, Dr. Richard Pears. For those of you who don't know Richard, he is an experienced librarian, a published author, along with many other strings to his bow. And he has been helping out libraries for many years with local history talks and walks. We are very pleased to have Richard here now to answer some questions live. So do send your comments in and your questions. You can use the small button below the video. And Richard, we already have comments coming in. We already have some questions for you. We have one from Joan. Sorry, that's just a comment. We've got one from Jason. Can you tell us about Tyneside flats and when they got inside toilets? Was this early or late compared to other towns?
Good question. I think a lot of them were built with outside toilets. I know, for example, some of the ones in Heaton and Wickham, I've talked to people who've said that they recall having outside toilets. Though clearly some were built with a bathroom in and out shut on the back. So again, I suspect it's probably a mixture. Some were built without toilets inside, and then some were fitted later, and then later ones have been built from the outset with sewers and toilets. I suppose it's whether the councils or the builders went to the extent of putting a pipe from the sewer into every home, or whether there was just a sewer pipe running up the backyard, so you've got to, it's down to cost, I imagine, like all things.
Okay, yeah, and they did vary a bit in design, and we've got a really useful comment actually from Joan, who said she lived in a Tyneside flat, and they got inside toilets in the mid-1960s.
Right, so that's, obviously fitted in.
That would,
yes.
We've got some others coming in from Jerry. So you mentioned that Skara Brae at the very start of your talk, Richard, had drains in their toilet area. Where did the waste actually go?
The drains led out of the midden, the refuse heap in which the houses were constructed, towards the seashore. This is a village that's right next to the seashore, and the people are gathering their fishing and they're getting shellfish, as I said. I think it's assumed that the water might have come in sufficient to maybe go into some of the end of the drains and take it away. I don't think anybody has suggested these were particularly efficient. In fact, I think part of the reason archaeologists suspect they were toilets is because of waste was found in them, and I think they were throwing cooking waste and everything else down these as well. It is quite remarkable to see, because they must have planned the drains before they built the houses. If you think about that, they're underneath the houses, and think, well, why didn't they just go outside?
Yeah.
But they must have thought it was important enough to have a drain within each of those houses. Whether that was, just because of the weather on Orkney can be so appalling, particularly in the winter, they thought, it might just be a seasonal thing. But so it seems some of the drains may well have been reached by water, or you just threw water down them to try and flush them up. But they're not particularly efficient in any way. There's nothing like the modern toilet with the vacuum that is pushing,
Yes.
things down. And there's, they're fairly shallow, so there's not even a steep drop to help you get rid of the waste either.
Well, it is interesting that a couple of the examples were in the north of the country, and that is quite interesting to think it could be a reason why people don't exactly want to wander out into the cold night. Yes. We've got some other questions coming in here, Richard, for you. Gong firmer sounds like a terrible job. So you talked about that when you were referencing Newcastle Keep.
Yes. Would
the waste they've collected just been taken to the river at that time?
Possibly, but I suspect it's actually being sold. I think the gong firmers, the night soilmen, are probably, taking it away and composting it or selling it to farmers. It's being used in agriculture, which is what was being used all over Britain and Europe at the time in the medieval period. Is that I'm using the euphemism waste, but basically a lot of this would be collected in the way that you collect horse manure and you put it on your garden. It's the same.
Okay.
It's the same kind of thing. Yes, I think Tony Robinson did a TV series a few years ago, The Worst Jobs in the World.
Yes.
I think the very first one he did was the gong firmer. And I think it must be difficult to, these people must have been like almost socially unacceptable.
Yeah.
They must have lived on the edge of the village or something like this, that you weren't, you didn't go near them, presumably.
Baldrick, it's funny you mentioned Tony Robinson. Baldrick definitely did spring to mind when you were talking about the gong firmer. Mm-hmm. We have a comment from Leanne who says, "Thank you for another great talk, Richard. I had limited knowledge of Skara Brae. And it's remarkable to think that Neolithic people planned their settlement so well thousands of years ago. And I guess that's what struck me. We're talking about town planning, really early town planning, that they planned those into the build of the houses.
Yeah, I think if you haven't been to Orkney, go now. It is a fantastic place. And I was there in 2000, and they found other settlements like Skara Brae since then, because the way the sea comes in at different times and sand dunes move and it covers them over. So there's been a lot more investigation, and as I say, they found settlements similar to Skara Brae as well. But yes, it is town planning. There's no doubt about it. There was a midden, where people have been living and throwing their waste for a long period beforehand, and they realised that if you dug down into this would give you the insulation against these very strong winds on Orkney. But as I said, there's a building that's quite clearly a factory. They're making it's being used for stone tool manufacture. It's not a house.
Yes.
Because of the chippings of the stone tools, the found remains of stone tools, and it doesn't have a hearth. It doesn't have it does have a hearth because they're using that to split the stone, but it doesn't have. It's not built like the others with the dresser, the beds around the outside and things. So it is like an industrial estate. It's like the Team Valley, on the edge of Gateshead.
It's fascinating.
There.
It really is. We have some more. A good one from Jason. Can you tell us about cleaning products for toilets? When did bleach and the like come in? Is that quite a recent
it's a very good question,
phenomenon,
which I'm not quite sure the answer. I suspect it is quite a recent example of manufacture. I suppose once there were more toilets within homes, people realised the need to get rid of to try and clean better than there is. We do only know about things like germs fairly recently in the Victorian period onwards. So there's not that knowledge of what is killing you if you have poor sanitation. It's just a knowledge that if you have poor sanitation, it can be, it can cause serious disease and illness. I suppose the other aspect of this is again, it's the smell. You know, you read about people like the Elizabethans going around with pomanders, you know, kind of
Yes.
scented things, because the people smelled as well. You know, it's that whole range of cleaning products that come in probably in the Victorian period as people have more indoor plumbing and they realize that the smell isn't outside at the end of the yard. You know, they're going to have to do something about cleaning indoors as well.
Yeah, it's just not something we think about these days, is it? It would be totally unacceptable now, but it's something people must have lived with every day in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Josie's got a brilliant comment. She said the Roman latrines with holes in wooden benches are exactly the same as the toilets we had in St. Joseph's School. So it's quite
well. There's an example of the technology worked at the first time round, so why change it?
If it's not broke. Another question from Jerry. Why do you think the technology was forgotten for so long after the kind of Roman Empire withdrew?
I think it was because the Romans had a very sophisticated society and the engineering ability to bring water supplies from miles and miles away. I think the Roman fort at Lanchester in County Durham, on top of a hill, the aqueduct that brings the water and that collects the water from springs all around has been traced for nearly 9 miles from the fort, you know. And
wow,
if you go to places like the south of France, you've got the Pont de Gard, huge aqueduct and bridge that brought water supply to the town of Nîmes, you know, a major Roman city. So the Romans had the society in which you had the engineers, you had the geologists, you had all of these people who are not just trying to make their own living, but they're being fed to do a professional job. And I think that disintegration of Roman society and the fragmentation that came after it, there just wasn't people were living by subsistence, you know, what they could grow or herd themselves. There wasn't that control of the environment that the Romans had until very, very recently. And, you know, we know the Romans were lead mining in Allendale. And again, it's quite a while, several centuries before that comes, you know, back into the same level of production, because lead is the ideal material for pipes and things, you know. It's malleable. So it's really having a whole range of technologies and the professional people with those technologies on hand to give you the sanitation. And that breaks down when Roman society breaks down.
So you really do need that society structure. And I guess the Romans were all working for that common goal of empire, which we weren't in Britain for quite a long time after that. A good one to end on, I think, Richard. You talked about the invention of the S-trap and the cistern and lots of other sort of improvements after that. Does that mean the British invented the modern toilet? Andy would like to know.
Right. Well, I did see on a website when I was researching about Skara Brae, you know, claim that Scotland invented the toilet because of Skara Brae. So you could probably say yes. I think it's interesting that a lot of these innovations took place in Britain, and that might be to do with the nature of Britain having the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th and 19th centuries. That there were just lots of people. Like Joseph Bramah was a locksmith, but he was willing to tinker with other things and, you know, try and solve other problems. And I think it's just having those people around. And you've got the technology, you know, we know like Derwentcote Ironworks and in Durham, or, you know, the sword makers that shot the bridge and things. You've got people who are used to using metal in different ways. And I think a lot of these come about because it just happens to be British society at the time had a bit like Roman society, you know, you just had the people around who were willing to put 2 and 2 together and get the right answer, you know. And I just hold up in the air the phrase French toilets.
That's a good one to end. Yes.
If you've ever tried to get a child to go, you know, to a toilet in the south of France, you'll know exactly what I mean.
Sorry, any French people listening, but yes,
apologies. Yes,
we do know what you mean. Thank you so much, Richard. And thank you everyone for joining us. That was fascinating. It was just amazing to learn, you know, it's just such an important part of our history, I think, that we don't think about. Do join us next week when Anthea Lang talks about burial practices, churchyards and cemeteries. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Richard. Stay safe and good night from Gateshead Archive.